Britain's jails are overflowing. More than 86,000 prisoners are currently incarcerated within their walls. For almost all of these prisoners, the aim is rehabilitation and release. But a tiny number are deemed so dangerous and depraved that they will never be freed. This extraordinary group of 47 men and 1 woman includes serial killers, torturers, hired assassins, and psychotic sadists. In some cases, the faces are familiar. Others are better known by the nicknames given to them by the press. But many of them you will never have heard of. This series will shine a light on the dark world of some of these killers. The subject of this film is a man who would one day be branded the Beast of Manchester. A man who tormented lone women.
Whoever had done this had smashed her face with concrete slabs beyond all recognition.
Mutilated their bodies.
Apparent to anybody that she was dead. Nobody could be survived like that.
And who went to extreme lengths to avoid capture.
Hardy would have had to file his teeth to an extent that it would be highly painful.
He kept going back to the body time and again, cutting it up once with an axe, sometimes with his bare hands.
Trevor Hardy was a dangerous predator who boasted of his crimes.
And as I'm sat here now, he just said to me, I did it.
A man who believed he was invincible.
I've no doubt that if he hadn't have been caught, then he would have killed again.
Who left a trail of destruction in his wake.
The only time I'll be really happy is when I get that letter saying he's dead.
Manchester, a city famous for industry and football, with a
He was never there. You know, like, from me being like 5, 6, 7, 8, he was never, ever, ever there. He was either in a approved school or Borstal or some institution.
But the Hardy children hadn't been brought up to behave badly.
My dad was very straight-laced. He'd never been in trouble in his life. And my mum, she always had cleaning jobs. She always worked. She always brought some money into the house.
But Trevor's wayward behaviour started to affect his father.
To a lot of the extent, he buried his head where Trevor was concerned. I think he was afraid of the stigma that he put on the family, even at such an early age, because of the way people talked about him and the way he did, because he was never out of trouble. He was never, ever out of trouble.
And Trevor Hardy's crimes were typical of a young offender making his mark.
Theft, petty crime really, lots of burglaries, and from what I could gather from his fellow criminals in the area, he was particularly proud of his ability to burgle houses, and he used to also boast that he never bothered taking property that could be identified. He just went for cash.
Trevor Hardy was already taking steps to avoid the long arm of the law, something he would later rely on to preserve his freedom.
What you've got to remember in them days is everybody left the doors open. But if Trevor Hardy was out of whatever institution he was in, people didn't leave the doors open because they didn't trust him. It was as simple as that.
At 15, he was jailed for 12 months for a series of 20-odd burglaries, and the judge told him that the public needed to be protected from him.
Hardy was getting his first taste of adult jail, but on the outside, his brother was paying the price.
My actual life was always overshadowed by Trevor. Parties, you know, school friends would have birthday parties and I was never invited because of who my brother was, because of his reputation, because of things he'd done. I think Trevor was very jealous of me because I come along late in life for my mum and dad, and he was always the youngest, and I don't think really Trevor ever come to terms with having a younger sibling.
Kerry Daines is a clinical forensic psychologist. She studies offenders, what motivates them, and what triggers their crimes.
Sibling rivalry is best understood as a struggle, if you like, for dominance and for attention from parents. Now, it's usually the younger child that is the nonconformist in the family. But the arrival of Colin would have upset the family dynamic because Trevor's already carved out his role as black sheep of the family. And I imagine that as the youngest, there was a level of tolerance for that. But as the focus shifts onto the new baby, I think that would have caused quite a bit of resentment.
As Trevor got older, he became dangerously violent.
He got a reputation as a bit of a bruiser. He was only 5 feet 7 inches tall and built like a whippet, but he was very handy with his fists and very quick to use them. So with him it was no sooner a word than a blow, and this often happened in the pubs around the area where he lived, from which many he was banned.
The thing is, he couldn't drink. He'd have maybe 4 or 5 drinks, but he was not a drinker. He didn't go out and drink and drink and drink and drink, but he got nasty with it. He could walk into a public house and the place would empty, because people would know sooner or later there'd be trouble.
And there was trouble. On one occasion, Hardy stabbed another man in the leg after a row, almost severing an artery.
Hardy accumulated a whole list of convictions and stayed in various correctional institutions before the age of 21. Now, what usually happens is that young juvenile delinquents, they grow up, they see prison as a deterrent, and they grow away from crime as they establish families and other relationships. Now, Hardy doesn't seem to have learnt from his mistakes. He doesn't respect authority. He's not responding to punishment, and as he grows older he becomes increasingly angry and increasingly dangerous.
Hardy had progressed from petty crime to violence, and from using his fists to carrying knives. His next attack was even more shocking.
There was an argument about who should pay for a round of drinks, and Trevor Hardy resolved the argument by hitting the other guy with a pickaxe and knocking him senseless.
The bloke never ever worked again, but if you talk to his family, they're always convinced that he was another victim, because he did eventually die of his injury.
Hardy's disregard for human life had landed him back in prison on a 5-year sentence for wounding with intent. On his release, he would embark on a murderous spree that would make him one of the most infamous killers in British history.
We lifted the cardboard and looked down, and it was the body of a young woman.
I first met Janet in the spring of 1974. Nice girl to meet. We got on great. We went out a couple of times. Tall girl, very good looking. Looked older, a lot older than she was.
Janet Leslie Stewart was just 15 years old. She lived in Harper Hay and was a Rose Queen at the local church. That year she was working at the Bellevue Entertainment Complex alongside Billy Burke.
I worked up till Christmas Eve. I think Leslie was working right through. So the last time I would have saw Leslie was, I'm sure it was Christmas Eve, and then expecting to see her when I came back in the January.
But on December the 31st, everything changed. But the truth was far more shocking. While on her way to the party, Leslie had bumped into Trevor Hardy. Without warning, he had plunged a knife into her neck before dragging her body to a secluded spot and burying her in a shallow grave.
It takes a very particular sort of person who has the lack of empathy necessary to plunge a knife into another human being. We know from research that even trained soldiers can't necessarily do this when it comes down to it in practice. Not only is he able to do this, he's still cold enough and calculated enough that he is able to keep his wherewithal and start to conceal the body.
With no sightings of Leslie, and with no proof she'd been murdered, Trevor Hardy had apparently got away with murder. He'd moved on from petty violence to commit the most terrible of crimes. But life for Hardy continued as normal. As he approached his 30th birthday, he met a woman called Sheila Farrow, and they immediately hit it off.
When he met Sheila Farrow, they became lovers the night after they met, and he said it wasn't very good because it took place on a kitchen floor, and an 8-year-old boy kept coming into the room and interrupting them. So not exactly Mills and Boon stuff. She was considerably older than Hardy, and he also described her on occasions as a mother figure.
Despite the stuttering start, they moved in together in various flats around Manchester, and they were frequently seen drinking in pubs in the suburb of Moston, an area that in July 1975 would witness Hardy's next vile attack.
A passerby had been walking down Lightbourne Road and he'd seen what appeared to be two legs projecting from a brick pile. We went to investigate the matter, and on approaching the brick pile in question, we saw that the shoes were missing from the legs, and that cardboard covered the rest of the torso. And we lifted the cardboard and looked down, and it was the body of a young woman.
Police officer Len Starkey was the first on the scene and had the grim task of attempting to identify the victim.
Apparent to anybody that she was dead. Nobody could be survived like that. She was lying on her back with her arms outstretched, semi-naked. The facial features were indistinguishable. They were so mutilated. and it was obvious that she'd been bitten in the region of the upper abdomen and the lower abdomen. Well, I was sickened to see that, wondering how a human being could do that to another human being.
Word quickly spread that a body had been found, and police soon discovered that a local girl had gone missing the previous night. Her name was Wanda Scala.
She was a 17-year-old girl who lived in the Lightbone Road area of Moston with her parents, and she worked in the local pub. And she'd been working there one night, and after work finished, I believe she had a game of pool or two, and then she set off home around about midnight.
Tragically, she never arrived. On her short walk home, Trevor Hardy struck, beating her viciously about the head before leaving her body under rubble and cardboard. Wanda hadn't been sexually assaulted or raped, but her nipple had been bitten off by her attacker.
Hardy has claimed that he read a book about Neville Heath, a man who was convicted of 2 murders and hanged in 1946. Now, Heath bit off one of the victim's nipples. I imagine that no doubt he did read about Neville Heath, and I'm sure that it was sexually gratifying to him, and he's incorporated those details into his own fantasies and his own offending.
Unlike Hardy's first murder of Leslie Stewart, there was no real attempt to hide his victim.
Her body was found the next morning in that site there, which was at the time a building site where the filling station was going to be built. Her home was just 200 yards away in that direction.
Forensic teams began a search for clues. Horrifically, parts of Wanda's body were still to be located.
I received a message like to search the area because they couldn't find their eyes. Searching the area on your hands and knees, turning the soil over with your hands. It was later on that I found out that they had found their eyes, but they had been buried in the abdomen.
There was a sort of mixed message from the finding of the body. One was that it had been a sex attack, but also the handbag was missing, which had money inside it. So a robbery was a possible motive.
With no leads or witnesses, an appeal was made through the media for help.
I was told by a detective I knew after the press conference that whoever had done this had smashed her face with concrete slabs beyond all recognition, and he said, "We're looking for a monster here."
2 days later, Trevor Hardy made a bizarre return to the scene of the crime to leave a clue.
Mysteriously, the pair of shoes that she'd been wearing that had disappeared came back to the scene where her body had been found. This led to speculation that whoever had killed Wanda Scala was in some way taunting the police.
For somebody who has and will go to really great lengths to conceal evidence, why Hardy would go back to a crime scene and take evidence with him is a mystery. It's often the case that somebody will take things away from a crime scene as trophies, souvenirs if you like, of what was an enjoyable event for them. You might have used the shoes as a masturbatory aid. Why he brought them back, though, I have no idea.
For several days, Trevor Hardy kept his deadly secret, walking around the area as if nothing was wrong. But an incredible revelation was just around the corner.
I'd gone down to my parents' house and I walked in as usual, and I was so shocked to see him sat there, and there was just no way out of it. He was there, and I'm thinking, of all the days I had to come here and he's here.
Colin Hardy hadn't seen his brother for months, but now they were face to face, and Trevor had plans.
He kept insisting that we went for a drink. And it was the last thing I wanted. All I wanted to do was get away from him. But he was insistent on going for a drink. So we got the bus, the 80 bus on Lightbound Road near the Gardeners pub, and we went into Middleton. And we was in a pub called the Albion. And all the time I was with him, I'm thinking, I've got to get away. I just didn't want to be with him. And as the night wore on, he started going on about this Wanda Scala murder. And I said to him, I said, well, why are you so interested in it? And as I'm sat here now, he just said to me, I did it. He wasn't excited. He wasn't agitated. It was like he was talking about, oh, have you seen me Auntie Dot? Have you seen me Auntie Anne? It was just like to him, a normal conversation. And I'm thinking, this is all crazy. This is not real. This is not real. This is not happening. This is, you don't sit there and say things like this.
Maybe Hardy's tongue was loosened by alcohol, or maybe he felt a burning need to brag to somebody about what he'd so far gotten away with. Or maybe his motives were more sinister. If you confess to a murder, that's going to terrify somebody. That's a good way to get power and control over somebody.
I was scared, and I did want to get away, but I just didn't know how to do it. And people listening might think, well, why didn't you just walk out? You didn't walk out on my brother. That was not an option.
With nowhere else to go, and Trevor getting more unpredictable, Colin reluctantly took his brother and Sheila Farrow back to his home.
And he just went berserk. He went absolute, he just lost it completely. And I can't even say why. But he left me unconscious and covered in blood at the bottom of the stairs. And then turned round to my ex-missus, as calmly as can be. Make me beans on toast, I'm hungry. And she was that scared, she made him beans on toast. I often thought, what would have happened that night if I had not took him back to my home? It could have all ended so very, very differently. But I think it would have gone on for a period of time more. I think he probably would have killed me.
In fear of his life, Colin considered whether he should call the police and report his brother's confession. The following day, he made his decision.
I think I spent 16 hours in Planthill police station, being cross-examined and everything. When they let me go, they'd been arrested, Trevor.
Trevor Hardy was once again being questioned by police, this time on suspicion of murder. But despite his pub confession, Trevor had no plans to remain in custody. He came up with a devious plot to trick the police and go on to kill again.
Hardy would have had to file his teeth to an extent that it would be highly painful, probably to the extent he would have to file the tooth down almost to gum level.
In Manchester, in 1975,
from the background that we picked up, yes, clearly he'd been nothing but trouble all his life. He'd been violent. He lived in the area. He was a prime suspect. We were expecting Hardy to be charged because the facts were that he fitted the bill, and we assumed that the police had got him in for...
Teeth are left upon the skin of the victim, and we have a process where we can analyse how the perpetrator's teeth match or do not match up to the injury on the victim.
But Hardy was already one step ahead and had arranged for a nail file to be smuggled into his cell.
According to the police, he filed his teeth down so that the bite marks wouldn't match his teeth.
Hardy would have had to file his teeth to an extent that it would be highly painful, probably to the extent he would have to file the tooth down almost to gum level, and that would expose the nerve of the tooth, which is an extremely sensitive part of the body.
With such an extensive criminal history, it's probably not that surprising that Hardy really knew the value of forensic evidence. And remember, this is back in the 70s, so forensic techniques were not widely known. This was well before the time of CSI. But to file your teeth down, it's painful just to think about it. So he must have been prepared to go to any lengths.
Police questioned Sheila Farrow on Hardy's movements on the night of the attack, but she told police they had been at home together. With no hard evidence and only Colin's account of a confession, police had to let Hardy go.
The police told me that they didn't believe me and that they had no option but to release him. And I did say at the time, be it on your own heads if he kills somebody else. I hope it's not me.
It appeared Trevor Hardy had got away with murder again, and he was back on the streets.
You imagine me, after what he's told me, what he's done to me, and then they let him go. I was absolutely petrified. I put wire on the windows, bottles on the windowsill at night, bolts, padlocks. I had an idea he'd come for me.
Colin's instincts were right. Seeking revenge for going to the police, Trevor Hardy paid his brother a visit.
My missus shouted out of the window and the neighbour did phone the police. And look as it, he was a big man, this policeman. And he didn't wait for backup, he just went straight up the stairs and laid into him.
With his brother apparently in the clear, Colin Hardy's own life began to spiral out of control.
When the police let him go, I went off the rails a bit. I suppose I couldn't handle things very well. Obviously, there'd been talk around Manchester that he had been arrested and they'd let him go. Mud sticks, I was his brother. So there was comments made to me and fisticuffs. I got into a scrape one night and I got jailed.
One Hardy brother was now behind bars, but it wasn't the one police had suspected of murder. And with no other suspects in the frame, Manchester was living in fear. A killer was still on the loose.
I think parents of teenage girls would have kept a very close eye on them, would have warned them against going anywhere isolated on their own, and would have advised them to stay in. As long as this killer was on the loose, they weren't safe.
In December 1975, Trevor Hardy once again hit the headlines, but it was for saving lives and not taking them.
On that occasion, he was being hailed a hero by the Manchester Evening News because there'd been a fire in a council property and Hardy had rescued his neighbours from the blaze. And so he was photographed and pictured in the local paper as being a hero who braved a fire to rescue his neighbours.
But everything wasn't quite as it seemed. Far from being the hero, police later discovered that Hardy had set the fire himself.
For someone who's narrowly escaped a murder charge, knows he's responsible for the death of 2 young women, you would think, wouldn't you, that he'd want to keep a low profile. But actually, he goes out and recklessly endangers his neighbours by causing a fire, but also recklessly endangers himself because, of course, he's attracting attention from police, and media attention might attract possible witnesses. So it seems to me...
And it wouldn't be long before he got the urge to do it again. Sharon Mossop was a 17-year-old girl living in Failsworth, in the east of the city. In March 1976, she was invited to a works party in nearby Bolton. Her father, Ralph, remembers it well.
She asked us to go with her and sit while it was over and have a bit of a drink afterwards. But we declined because the youngsters like to be together. Just after midnight, we got a phone call. She was waiting for the all-night bus down in Manchester Central, and she asked what number bus she would get, and we told her. The next morning, Sharon she hadn't slept in her bed.
Later that day, local journalist Peter Phelps received a phone call.
I was in the Oldham Cron and we had a tip-off from a reader saying there were police frogmen down at the canal here in Failsworth and we didn't know what was going on. So I was dispatched. It was right on deadline. Oldham is a small town where everybody seemed to know what was going on and the newspaper was very involved. So any activity like that would have been reported. It could have been anything.
But it was soon clear this was no false alarm.
Well, I arrived on the scene, stood on the road bridge over the canal, looked down onto the bank, and yards away there were a number of police, frogmen and personnel clustered around a naked body of a teenage girl, clearly laid across the towpath. It was a grim scene. The first thing I did was to phone the news desk and say that a body had come out of the canal. We were right on the deadline. There was no time to verify any other facts. The news desk then were in touch with the police and learnt that a full-scale murder hunt had been launched.
With word spreading of police activity in the area, and with his daughter still missing, Ralph Mossop took a walk to the canal to see what was going on.
I saw all the police, and I just broke down. I knew, I don't know why, but I knew that something was wrong. I knew it was Sharon.
Ralph's parental instincts were right. Sharon Mossop had been just 200 yards from her home when Hardy had attacked her, strangling her with her own tights, beating her about the head, and plunging her body into the icy waters of the canal. Once again, he'd bitten off his victim's nipple.
I often think that if I'd have got dressed and went down to pick her up, she wouldn't have to get that bus, and it wouldn't have happened.
Again, Hardy has felt compelled to kill another teenage girl with gratuitous amounts of violence, and he's mutilated her. At this point, the police will definitely be making links, and I think it's begun to dawn on them that they've got a serial killer on their hands.
News of Sharon's gruesome death was reported across the country.
I used to have a paper delivered to my cell every day, the Daily Mirror. And I got back from the workshop one day and I picked up the paper, and right on the front headlines was another girl had been killed in Manchester. And I just knew. As soon as I picked up that paper, I knew it was him. I just knew. Up here, I knew.
The evidence suggested a serial killer was on the loose, and whoever had killed Sharon had probably killed Wanda Scala months earlier. Both girls were of a similar age, and both had been killed just yards from their homes, late at night. Crucially, both had had their nipples bitten off before their bodies were dumped. Journalist Alan Hart, who had reported on Wanda's death, realised the cases might be linked.
What we'd had was a one-off killing of a girl, that is to say Wanda Scala, but now we'd got two, and all happening very close by. So by now there was a lot of fear in the area around northeast Manchester.
By now, Trevor Hardy was on the run. He'd just been named as a suspect for a violent assault in a nightclub toilet. A woman claimed to have been attacked by Hardy and throttled to within an inch of her life. She even bit through her own tongue and only survived when the attacker was disturbed and fled. Detectives hunting for Hardy visited Sheila Farrow. She revealed that their relationship was over and dramatically told how Hardy's alibi for the Wanda Scala murder had been a lie. Hardy was now the #1 suspect for Wanda Scala's murder and the slaying of Sharon Mossoff. He was tracked down to a house in Stockport and arrested.
I was at work and one of my colleagues said, "I've seen the headlines in the paper." I said no, and he showed me. And it was somebody was being questioned over the murder of my daughter.
Police were confident they had their man, and Hardy was held on suspicion of 2 murders. But they would soon hear a detailed confession to 3 gruesome killings.
He kept going back to the body time and again, cutting it up once with an axe, sometimes with his bare hands.
Isolated spot in Newton Heath, just a mile from Leslie Stewart's home.
We're just coming along 10 Acres Lane now. This was a derelict croft at the time of the murder, and Trevor Hardy killed Leslie Stewart on this croft and buried her in various places around it.
But Hardy had come up with a gruesome plan to prevent the body being discovered.
He kept going back to the body time and again, cutting it up once with an axe, sometimes, presumably after it had decomposed a little, with his bare hands. It's just too terrible to think about.
Killers will sometimes revisit a body in order to prolong the high of a killing, to relive it in some way, but to continuously go back to a victim 3 months after they've died, that's simply too disturbing for most to contemplate. Now, Hardy goes back and we know that he removes the head, the hands and the feet of his victim. It might be that he was desperate to remove future evidence. I think it's more likely that he also got some form of strange gratification from what he was doing.
It had been more than 18 months since Leslie Stewart had gone missing, but no one assumed she'd been murdered. Her former boyfriend, Billy Burke, recalls reading the devastating news.
I'd come home on the 53 bus, and I was halfway up the stairs waiting for other people to get off, and there was a guy in front of me. He had a Manchester Evening News unfolded, and the headlines were just Janet Leslie Stewart's body found. Big shock. Never entered my head anything like that had ever happened to.
Hardy's confession suggested he'd mistaken Leslie for a former lover, and that Wanda Scala's murder had been a mugging gone wrong. For his final confession, he said he'd been burgling a hardware store when Sharon Mossoff disturbed him. Hardy had bitten Sharon, echoing his attack on Wanda, but hours later he realized the bite would link his crimes together. Desperate to avoid detection, Hardy returned to the scene armed with a screwdriver and dived into the canal, mutilating his victim in the hope the bite mark wouldn't be spotted.
The fact that Hardy bit Sharon's nipple, he obviously couldn't help but bite it, and then felt that he had to jump into a cold canal in order to remove the evidence, shows me quite plainly that this is not part of some elaborate scheme to cover up the motivation for his crimes. This is clearly a very central part of his sadistic fantasies and his need to kill. As to why Hardy chose this time to confess to his crimes, well, we can only speculate. It might be that he knew at this point that the game was definitely up, or maybe there was a return of that need for him to just offload, maybe even to boast about what he'd been doing.
There was no joy. There was no punch in the air saying yes, yes, yes. I felt sad for my mum and dad. I felt sad for the families that we'd all had to go through that because of one person.
Hardy was given a whole life tariff. He joined the list of prisoners deemed so dangerous that they will never be allowed back into society.
I can see no motive apart from sexual gratification, the pure sadistic enjoyment of taking a life. Now that can be very addictive, and I've no doubt that if he hadn't have been caught, then he would have killed again.
Every single day it's in your mind. You don't forget. You can't forget something like that. It's not that easy. He showed no remorse. He's a beast, and he deserved to be where he is. If they can't hang him, let him be where he is till he dies. And my message to him is, rot in hell.
I've no desire to see him, and I've no desire to speak with him or to even write to him. None whatsoever. The only time I'll be really happy is when I get that letter saying he's dead.